right, everybody, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is our live stream today, June 5th, 2024, joined by Jack Gorsline. How are you doing today, Jack?
I am good, Joe. Thanks for having me. It's an honor. I'm a long time listener, big fan, and yeah, honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely appreciate you making it and bringing a lot of really important stuff to the table here. I think we can fairly say the Massachusetts psychedelic policy, drug reform in general, isn't getting the press it deserves or needs, given
hmm
um, kind of how pivotal we both suspect Massachusetts could be in this whole nationwide, if not international, project. Um, could you give a little bit of background on yourself, like what kind of journalism have you done to date? Who have you done work for? And then, yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so I am currently a regular contributor for an outlet based here in New England, Talking Joints Memo, largest cannabis industry and news-specific media outlet in New England. Also work with the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, one of TJM's partner sites, but have been covering the psychedelic legalization movement here in Massachusetts for about 9 months. Actually got my start, and we're going to be talking about the day, but got my start covering Bay Staters for Natural Medicine events. And I'm very grateful to have gotten my start covering this issue from within the grassroots community. It has led to a lot of very interesting realizations. So,
Great. Yeah. And I when can you before we kind of start digging into the
of
journalism
course.
aspect, like how did psychedelics just come on your radar generally? Anyway, not
Yeah.
perhaps from any angle.
Yeah. So I originally hail from Richmond, Virginia. My family has a complex history of mental illness, and I am grateful to my mother in particular for moving heaven and earth to try to gain myself, an ADHD individual, with the very best psychiatric care that she could possibly get access to. But as a result, in a bad era, I was born in '95, came up in the mid 2000s, obviously, um, was medicated on 13 different antipsychotics or antidepressants before I turned 15. So
Mm,
the both the awareness of the complex history of severe mental illness within my family tree and my own struggles as a kind of a victim of sorts of the psychiatric industrial complex, if you will, or the over medication crisis, if you will, led me to be, definitely interested in psychedelics. I'm not per se a regular recreational user by any means. I'm very aware and very fascinated by both power and potential of these substances. And really, as someone who's aware of that weight in particular, but has met with a number of folks who had their lives changed for the better and healed themselves due to increased access to these substances, I'm most interested in the foot to pavement policy conversations. What does this look like in a post legalization reality in the United States, and local level, state level, federal? How does this actually proliferate in the day-to-day lives of not only those who are keenly interested in learning more about psychedelics today, but those who will be in a post-passage, post-legalization world. So I would describe myself as a pragmatic optimist in my view of legal psychedelics. I'm not a policy expert. I like to say to anybody that I speak to about this issue, whether it's in interview capacity or otherwise, that I really pride myself on asking the questions that I think somebody who might know nothing about any of this and might not have a background in civics education or an awareness of the state ballot initiative petition process here in Massachusetts. I want to ask the questions that they want to ask but don't know how or don't know where to turn. Um,
right.
yes, sir.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. That's helpful. And well, let's dig in. Like what have you observed happening um over the past 9 months in the psychedelic progress of Massachusetts? I know a lot of people there. I was born there. Um, I was doing my first in-person psychedelic advocacy in Boston ages and ages ago. So what is happening now?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note, obviously, anybody who knows anything about Boston is aware that this is not only kind of the educational mecca of the Western world, if you will, with so many powerful and influential academic institutions, but is really a very proliferate biotech and finance tech hub in particular. So the merging of AI and psychedelic research here in this town in particular makes Massachusetts a key battleground for any number of agendas on any side of this equation. But over the last 9 months in particular, we've seen a public narrative from Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, a group that has been long involved, dating back to the days of the pandemic, and claims responsibility for the successful decriminalization of psychedelic substances across a number of cities in Massachusetts. I think 7 and counting, if I'm not mistaken. What's important to note there, and this is one of the first things that I'd love to discuss, is that there is a distinct difference between a decriminalization measure and a municipal resolution. Uh, all of the cities in Massachusetts so far have issued municipal resolutions. These are not legally binding. They are declarations that, by and large, the war on drugs was a failure, and a conscious, conscious stating deprioritization of the prosecution and arrest of individuals for possession of psychedelic substances, specifically, ranging from specifically just psilocybin in some cities to including ibogaine, DMT, mescaline, and others. I would encourage, everybody that's interested in the specifics of those local measures to check out psychedelicalpha.com. They have a really great ongoing and running tracker that is really helpful in figuring out what the specifics of policy is on a local level and state by state as well. So that's one major issue. But the Bay Staters' rhetoric over the last year or so really has been, one of what I would describe as pretty vitriolic towards representatives of New Approach Political Action Committee, and by extension, the Massachusetts Mass for Mental Health Options. I apologize, getting all twisted over my words here, but there has been a significant amount of criticism over a number of different, policy specifics. One of the frequent espoused claims of Bay Staters representatives is that the PAC actually never consulted anyone in the state in terms of the vibrant grassroots activist community that does exist here on their crafting of what is now known as, formally as, an act relative to the taxation and regulation of natural psychedelic substances, formerly also known as Massachusetts Bill H4255, I believe. But to jog my memory here, apologies. So there's been anyways, I would describe the Bay Staters, approach to their relationship with the PAC as very hot and cold. Early on, there seemed to be a genuine effort from the PAC. I actually reported on this in my recap of the March 26th hearing here in Massachusetts in front of the State Joint Committee on Special Election Initiative petitions, that despite Davis's claims that New Approach never consulted him directly, there was an exchange of emails that I was provided between New Approach and representatives of Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, in which New Approach specifically asked for input on a number of key policy issues that Davis has frequently since then, vocally criticized about the ballot measures parameters. It's also worth noting that one of the key elements of Davis's criticism and Bay Staters' criticism is the independently appointed, non-elected control commission above, in the legalization regulatory body. Very controversial to a number of people across this issue. Obviously, there's been a number of criticisms of a similar model in the cannabis industry here in Massachusetts, but New Approach sought specific input on a very popular and Mason Marks from Harvard presented idea to kind of weave a regulatory body into the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. So the attempt was made to have a detailed approach and detailed input from the grassroots community. Now, in that same email exchange, Davis indicated that, and I reported on this in my early April article, Davis indicated that he would loop in his fellow grassroots leaders as to the discussions and follow up with their input. However, I've heard from a number of activists one of whom claimed that when they confronted Davis via text about not being kept in the loop and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "I don't have to. I choose to. I don't have to tell you anything. I choose to." So one thing that I will say, and I want to stray away from having this be a Bay Stater specific commentary, because the opposition coalition that's forming across the state is fascinating in its variety and the various reasons why this diverse group of opposed parties are actually opposed. So I do want to speed up here in a second, but there's a couple of specific policy complaints that Bay Staters has voiced over the last few weeks that I think are worth pointing out as what I would describe as willful misinterpretations of the law. So not only is one of the claims that Bay Staters has made recently on Twitter is that the measure would make grow bags illegal. This is false. Actually, looking directly at the text, and I'm quoting from Section 6 on page 24 of H4255. A person 21 years or older shall not be arrested, prosecuted, penalized, sanctioned, or disqualified, and shall not be subject to seizure or forfeiture of assets for possessing, purchasing, or otherwise obtaining or manufacturing, otherwise transferring paraphernalia used for natural psychedelic substance-related activities, or for selling or otherwise transferring paraphernalia used for natural psychedelic substance-related activities to a person over the age of 21. There's
So
nothing in
I'm
there.
hearing that there's
Sorry, go
just
ahead.
like I'm hearing that there's a lot of potential misinformation being spread about
Yes.
what's actually happening, and it seems willful. Like, is there a certain intent that you suspect around this, or like why is this happening?
Well, what's interesting is that what initially seemed like Bay Staters' attempt to, bring about this substitute ballot measure of sorts that they still seem to be claiming online is one of their top priorities. Um, Behind the scenes, it's become clear, and I reported on this earlier in the month of May, but uh, Bay Staters has actually been directly involved in outreach to the Assistant Attorney General to loop in representatives of the newly formed opposition campaign, formerly called the Coalition for Safe Communities. This is basically comprised of two DC-based anti-drug lobby groups, the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions and Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Kevin Sabat, a longtime prohibitionist of sorts, a controversial figure in the Massachusetts cannabis scene for sure, is the de facto leader of both groups. And what's curious specifically about this is that Davis looped. So, anyways, I apologize. I'm losing my train of thought here, Joe. So, apologies. Checking my notes
Yeah,
here.
it's all good. So we have a number of parties involved, right? We have the
Yes,
national
sir.
parties. We have, I'm sure, Decriminalized Nature is applying some interesting pressure. Bay Staters
Yes.
is separate from Decriminalized Nature. New Approach PAC is also quite different and independent. Um,
Hmm.
so there's a lot of stakeholders. Then there's local opposition to Bay Staters, which is a really interesting set of people. You said
Hmm.
with interesting ties.
Yes. So, what's important to understand about the Coalition for Safe Communities, in particular, is that the spokesperson is a doctor, a heart surgeon from Massachusetts General Hospital named Dr. Anahita Dua, incredibly well regarded in her field, and is, also the executive director of another political action committee called Healthcare for Action PAC, a blue-leaning organization that actively seeks out and encourages and supports doctors and healthcare professionals to run for public office. Um, the treasurer of that same coalition, Coalition for Safe Communities, is a man named Charles Gant. He's the CFA at Red Curb Software based in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He's also the treasurer of Make America Great Again, Inc., the super PAC backing Donald Trump's presidential reelection campaign right now. That group was formed in early March of 2021, just weeks after the Capitol riots on January 6th. So it is interesting that these two very politically opposed or ideologically polar opposite, if you will, or individuals from very staunchly different parts of the political arena have come together as supporters of this opposition coalition. But even more curiously, is the emergence of a number of new groups. As of last week, the Massachusetts Municipal Association explicitly voiced their opposition to the ballot measure. They have come out as pro decriminalization, but anti legalization, specifically with this ballot measure. What's very curious to note is that in an executive summary of Bay Staters' official stance on the initiative petition dating back to last fall, prior to the finalization of the measure as it currently stands, Bay Staters called for the inclusion of Massachusetts Municipal Association in the discussions of that process. But again, we know that Bay Staters was given the opportunity to directly input on the entire process and declined to do so, withholding that information from a variety of other key organizers in the grassroots community. So the emergence of the MMA is no surprise to anybody who's aware of the MMA's longtime stance on cannabis laws, and also with that connection to local activist groups that are focused on local decriminalization efforts like that of the Bay Staters for Natural Medicine. A couple of other things that are worth noting are the emergence of the Citizens Commission for Human Rights. I was fortunate enough to cover the fourth annual Psychedelic Therapeutics and Drug Development Conference here in Boston just a couple of weeks ago on May 24th and 25th. On the 25th, that Friday, outside of the Revere Hotel, was a small group of protesters from the CCHR's New England chapter. Now, a little bit of background on the CCHR, they're a group that describes psychiatry as the industry of death. They're a group that, in looking at the flyer that they provided me right here, are referencing, for example, and I'm reading directly from the document, psychiatric disorders are not medical diseases. There are no lab tests, brain scans. It's very standard anti-psychiatry language, right? I spoke directly with CCHR New England Executive Director Paul Bradford on site that day and asked, have you been contacted by anybody from the opposition coalition? He did confirm that they had been contacted. He maintained that the three activists that were on site that day were there on their own accord on behalf of the CCHR New England alone and not in tandem with any other organization. But it is worth noting that there's a clear connection with some of the CCHR's ideology and some of the connections to the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society and their president, Tufts University professor and longtime psychiatric stalwart, Dr. Nasir Ghami. He spoke at the Massachusetts hearing on March 26th, and among other things, categorized psilocybin as a drug of abuse, claimed that cocaine and methamphetamine have no physiological symptoms of addiction. And when asked what he saw as the timeline for the federal approval of psychedelic drugs, he noted that there's a number of biotech and pharmaceutical companies actively working on these drugs and looking to make a profit, and that he anticipated that a breakthrough would be soon to follow. So it is worth noting that Ghami is what I would describe as probably about as anti-psychiatry as a psychiatrist can possibly be while being a member of the psychiatric establishment itself. On his podcast, the Dr. Nasir Ghami podcast, some of the episodes are titled such as Why the DSM is Mostly False, Adult ADHD is a Myth. He is a frequent espouser of the merits of lithium as a treatment for severe mental illness, but has cast doubts repeatedly on the effectiveness of novel and longstanding antipsychotics. It's a controversial topic within psychiatric medicine as to regards of the effectiveness of certain antipsychotic medications. So I'm not going to fray into who's right or who's wrong there, but it is very curious that this is a doctor who is frequently published in Mad in America, which, for those who are aware, is kind of like the anti-psychiatry HQ of the internet for political rhetoric, one of. And that is an organization CCHR frequently references in their own literature.
So the opposition to a lot of these decriminalization measures are coming, quite interestingly, from a robust place of anti-psychiatry, which is curious to me.
Mm-hmm.
I would figure there would be some interesting rhetoric around ending the drug war from Mad in America. I know I personally have appreciated a number of pieces in Mad in America. Some of our
Yeah.
writers and contributors have put stuff there, and let's not totally rule out that psychiatry is free of critique. Like we should be
Oh,
having
no.
the ability and freedom to have robust conversations here about all this stuff. And but yeah,
Of
let's just
course.
say that your point is that these people have deep ties to the anti-psychiatry movement. Where do we want to go from here in this narrative?
Well, I think it's important to point out, um, first and foremost, to your point, I am by no means trying to claim that psychiatry is without criticism. I've
Hmm.
obviously opened up this conversation by, disclosing my own complicated history with psychiatric medicine. Uh, that said, I do think, yeah, there's a lot of fantastic contributors to or publications like Mad in America, and I think they are just as worthy of listening to as anybody else in this space. And I think that psychiatry should be challenged. Science should be challenged so that it can evolve, so that we can better understand how to treat a lot of these conditions and a lot of these ailments that so many people are suffering from. Um, as far as where we go from here, I think it's important to point out. Um, Admittedly, drawing a bit of a blank. I think one thing that I think is worth noting is the emergence of the Massachusetts Medical Society alongside the MPS in their opposition, but the Massachusetts Medical Society very clearly linked to that of heart surgeon Dr. Dua in their opposition, citing ibogaine and its cardiotoxic nature, so they claim, and its increased risk for arrhythmia and irregular heartbeats as their cause, their primary concern over its inclusion in the measure itself. I also, um, I think it's important to point out that the home grow provisions that the anti-drug lobby folks over at the community coalition for safe communities are particularly protesting and particularly up in ire about, um, like I said, are one of the key provisions that were included that Bay Staters and many members of the grassroots community here in Massachusetts fought so, staunchly for the inclusion of and pushed the pack to include. Now, again, trace it back. There's clearly an opportunity for input to have a real conversation rather than publicly lambasting or criticizing them into including it. Um, but at this point, in an article that was released in the Greenfield Recorder shortly after the hearing, uh, Bay Staters cited home grow provisions as being too restrictive. Again, 12 foot by 12 foot enclosure. That seems pretty big. I don't have a stance on
Well,
whether or
are we
not that's
talking
too
like
big or too
enclosure,
small.
like you have to lock it up, like lock and
No, like a
key kind of
12,
enclosure?
so a 12 foot by 12-foot space box of sorts.
Okay. And do we
I,
have any kind of like height restrictions so we could have like a giant tower or something?
to my understanding, that is not especially defined, in
Hmm.
the measure.
Yeah.
The 12 foot by 12 foot is the key number, parameters there. Um,
Right. And this is like a common bit of dialogue and debate in the decriminalization scene. Um, I like we can even ask, to what degree is cannabis legal? Like, yay, cannabis is legal. We can grow it at home and buy it in stores for a lot of money. But in Massachusetts, isn't it limited to like 6 plants? Which is
yeah, I think it's,
somewhat
yep.
absurd and cartoonish to call that legalization. And I think I understand where Bay Staters is pushing back. I just, what are we actually fighting for is one.
Hmm.
And, if we were going to have that kind of limitation, we should have some sort of care model similar to what early medical cannabis had, in my opinion, where somebody can grow for somebody else and have like that
Agreed.
allocated. But that's more of a regulatory framework than a decriminalization framework of sorts. It's very different
Hmm.
conversation.
Agreed. Yeah. Um, I also think, it's worth noting that just that, yeah, I mean, I think that fighting for more specifics surrounding home grow provisions. And one thing, you're jogging my memory here. One thing that I do think is worth pointing out is that if the ballot measure passes in November, the decriminalization provisions would go into effect on December 14th. Now, the post passage implementation process and the amendments to the legislature, we've seen that drag on in Oregon and Colorado, obviously, over a number of years. It's still not really set in stone. So the regulatory framework piece will be a process that extends for at least a year in terms of what, licensing, etc. But another thing that I think is important to point out, kind of along those lines, is the grassroots community here in Massachusetts is much more diverse than just one organization. I know that there's a lot of controversy surrounding kind of the dissolution or disbandment, or back in the day, of Decrim Massachusetts. Part of that was due to kind of a falling out with some members from the national organization, but um, the diversity of the psychedelics community here in Massachusetts is really, I think, one of its greatest strengths. I've spoken with members, of all political identities. Specifically, one of the staunchest advocates within the legislature itself here of legalizing psychedelics is Representative Nicholas Waldaiga, the self-described most conservative member of the Massachusetts state legislature. Now, that might be the equivalent of Bernie Sanders in Georgia. I will defer to policy experts as to how they equivocate that. But he's introduced himself 7 different uh, pieces of legislation in an attempt to legalize psychedelics, one of which has actually gained some solid traction within the legislature, House Bill H3605, which would establish a fairly affordable regulatory framework for licensing within, again, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. I think it would be $150 for the application fee, and it would be a similar fee for renewal. So there are a lot of activists across the space that are not exclusive to being affiliated with Bay Staters.
Hmm.
And those folks in particular, I think, are very keen to elevate their own voices and have a larger part in the conversation moving forward in terms of who's referenced in public reporting of ongoing conversations. One thing that I do
So
think,
I want to jump
sorry, go
in
ahead.
here, Jack.
Yes, sir.
So I've I watched Oregon very closely. I watched Colorado quite closely. I've been on the sidelines. I live in Colorado. Have for 12 years or something. So um, I've watched external forces come into the state and do things that didn't super feel democratic. Um, and I'm wondering if you could talk about this tension between New Approach and Bay Staters and whatever other parties are playing here. Like I want to like as you're a journalist, I want to like try to like how do we just understand like what is actually happening and what are like is Bay Staters able to justify some of this stuff a little bit? Like I've been a victim of Bay Staters a few times that I felt was quite unfair.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I want to support what you're up to out there, friends, but how many times can you come at me and attack me with weird accusations like Maps gave me money, which I wish was true and isn't true, like, but how do we
Yeah,
balance this and how does Bay Staters justify this publicly?
I admittedly think it's really hard to. I admittedly, I reached out to Bay Staters for comment multitude of times prior to my reporting of the revealed emails that he had sent to the Assistant Attorney General attempting to introduce the anti-drug lobby representatives, um, and did not receive a response to my request for comment. So he's been very mum on explaining some of the thinking here. And again, I think it's worth noting that the rhetoric surrounding a lack of input from New Approach by Davis. I'm not here saying that the
Well, I
pack
was not
is.
asked. So I'll
Sorry, go ahead.
speak from my opinion and what I hear you saying. There is evidence that James was included for some conversation. In my experience, I was not consulted at all, and I had,
Hmm.
mm, quite a bit of at least name recognition from the people who
Yeah.
were involved, and I'm still salty about it. So yes, there's one bit of evidence around that to James. The way I've seen that play out in the past is like a really short window for response. Like we're in the
Hmm.
last minute and we're going to do this big thing, and oh yeah, community
Yeah.
engagement. Let's like hear your complaints and not do anything, which may or may not be a fair characterization of how this is playing out in Massachusetts, but this is kind of what I've been dealing with. And again, I'm
Hmm.
not I'm not trying to justify Bay Staters' actions. I just want to make sure like
Of
my
course.
experience with interacting with these folks, how it's kind of been to date.
Hmm. No, yeah, totally understand. I
And it's
think.
always a moving scene. Like they're becoming people that listen more.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. One of the things that I've heard frequently from PAC officials about the Massachusetts campaign compared to the Oregon and Colorado efforts is that there was a lot left on the table, and there were a lot of conversations that, in hindsight, they seem to wish that they'd had. Again, I can't speak to anyone at the PAC's specific intentions and what potential influences might be espoused upon them from various benefactors, et cetera. But uh, I think with exchange of emails dating across a number of months, policy by policy, line of questioning. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And in response, the only concern that was raised, or the main priority that was voiced by Bay Staters in that conversation, was that they were really focused on community education and wanting to increase awareness surrounding microdose, education in particular. Now, another thing that was publicly available to verify, et cetera. And I reported on this back in February. Uh, Bay Staters disclosed this to a number of activists close to their organization, but kept it largely quiet. You mentioned criticism of an accusation that you'd received money from MAPS. Uh, just before Bay Staters' public rhetoric changed surrounding their stance towards the PAC and their willingness to cooperate, and some of their increasingly vocal criticism, they received a $35,000 donation directly from New Approach, which at the time, New Approach spokesperson Jared Moffat categorized, as a show of good faith, you know, uh, an acknowledgement of the great work that Bay Staters had done in this space, and kind of a sign of commitment to partnership. Whereas Davis described it as a thinly veiled attempt to influence or silence their specific concerns about certain parameters of the bill. Now, again, I'm not privy to the private conversations between two individuals outside of the emails that I was provided access to, but I can say that with the reveals that followed the disclosure of that donation publicly, it does seem like accusations of acting in bad faith have merit. Now, again, this is it's totally reasonable based on what we've seen in Oregon and Colorado to have skepticism about what the outcome will be based on the PAC's intentions a year from now or 2 years from now in the post-passage amendment process. All we can go off, though, in this instance is the documented communication that we do have, which
Mm-hmm.
indicates that there was simply, rather than a lack of effort, there was a robust effort to get involved and connect with a number of different grassroots
Mm-hmm.
activists in this space.
So let's pause there. And how are we actually framing? How did Bay Staters frame it in, like, so we
In
have
their
evidence of
response,
robust effort. And what was the Bay Staters reply there? Like,
so
no effort.
the Bay Staters statement, and kind of running line is the PAC kind of came into the state and didn't consult with any grassroots activists. Now, their response to uh, the criticisms of that. Sorry, losing my train of thought again. So the PAC, apologies, Joe, uh, losing my footing here a little bit. Or jog my memory a little bit. I apologize. The ADHD is working
Sure.
on me today.
Yeah. So we were chatting about the Bay Staters' response to
Yes,
the
yes, yes, yes.
efforts
Okay,
of
yes,
the PAC to involve Bay Staters. Like, Bay Staters is saying it didn't happen, right? Like, long and short.
yes. But
Yeah.
yeah, but in the direct response that Bay Staters provided, and I would encourage folks to go check out my reporting on this issue and my hearing recap. There's a link to the full text of all of the full email exchange. Uh, Bay Staters said, we plan to embargo this information you provided us about your questions for us about policy specifics, and we will loop in our fellow grassroots coalition leaders. And they didn't do that, point blank, period. Um, so again, I think the response and the claim that there was, no attempt at all, clearly not true. But then to cast, a broader kind of, to kind of skew and stoke fear over, well, we don't know their intentions, when so many members of the grassroots community might have had an opportunity to learn more about the PAC's intentions if they were actually looped into that conversation. I think, that's what's most tragic, because we've been talking about, and so many people have reported on this issue, over the last 9 months, as Bay Staters has pushed, and I was guilty of this too. Bay Staters has pushed New Approach to the brink and forced them to make major concessions, and really hasn't let up and is being incredibly brave. And simply put, that was really not at all the case, and was a kind of a self-inflating narrative, if you ask me. It's also worth noting that last week an article came out in the Greenfield Recorder that specifically quoted James Davis, founder of Bay Staters, about his opposition, and he claimed in that article that former former being a keyword, their partner organizations, Parents for Plant Medicine and New England Veterans for Plant Medicine, are still currently aligned with Bay Staters' opposition to the ballot measure. This is simply not true. In my May 8th article published on talkingjointsmellow.com, both Jamie Morey, founder for Parents for Plant Medicine, and Mike Patello, who's the founder of New England Veterans for Plant Medicine, publicly disavowed and lambasted Davis for what Patello described as a subversive shadow campaign that he believed was for being waged for self-serving reasons and due to egocentric behavior. So again, I think more than anything else, especially after speaking to almost 24 former Bay Staters volunteers, collaborators, multiple board members, all of whom describe a pattern of behavior that led them all to leave the movement here in Massachusetts for one reason or another, at least in part because of said behavior over the last 2 years. So there was a lot of momentum that existed prior to Bay Staters' emergence to the forefront of this movement here in Massachusetts. And it's left me wondering what could have been if there was a much more robust grassroots coalition actually working in tandem with the PAC from day one. We're not going to know, unfortunately. And I think only time will tell if the ballot measure passes. I think as far as the opposite, sorry, I would like to pivot and talk a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So New Approach, like this has happened in Colorado. This has happened in Oregon for sure. They've made the statement that they have tried to reach out to the local community. In some cases, it hasn't been as true as they suggest. And I find that troubling. Like it seems to be part of their playbook. Come in, we know what's best for Massachusetts, Colorado, Oregon, etc. And how emperor-like of them, right? Like I don't really know exactly how to think about this, but I do think that well-moneyed organizations can, on occasion, provide half truths instead of providing the full truth. So like,
agreed 100%.
Did they is there evidence like rock solid? Like, is it true? And like, did James really get this kind of chance to respond that they're saying
Yes.
he did? He did.
Yes, unequivocally. Yes.
Unequivocally, yes.
I stand by that.
And what evidence did we get? Was it screenshots of emails or what?
I was provided direct verified copies of the emails from a source close to the campaign. Mm-hmm. They're embedded. They're provided in a PDF link in that article summarizing the hearing recap, and I'm happy to provide them to you to distribute as well.
And so to your
but again, these are
earlier,
emails dating.
I don't really need to see it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't really need to see them. But James comes back and says it's not true. I have issues with James, right? But I just think it's good to get the story straight and potentially also doubt a little bit of New Approach. Like we should have some cynicism based on past behavior. And yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? But is this the most contested thing in the battle? It's like, what is true here? What is not true here? Like so let's back up and put a pause on it. Like, what is happening in Massachusetts? Like, what is this bill that New Approach is trying to put forward and other groups are supporting?
Yeah, so the bill as it currently stands, an act relative to the regulation and taxation of natural psychedelic substances, would both decriminalize psilocybin, ibogaine, DMT, as well as mescaline. The personal quantities are a little bit odd. I believe it's 18 grams of mescaline, 30 grams of ibogaine, 1 gram of psilocybin, and 1 gram of psilocin. And I'm off the top of my head, cannot remember the specific quantity for DMT, but it's fairly broad. It also provides, a loose, what I would describe as a loose regulatory framework for the creation of a privately appointed, similar to that of the Cannabis Control Commission here in Massachusetts, but a privately appointed regulatory board. That is a key complaint and point of criticism from not only Bay Staters, but a number of folks across the grassroots community. We've seen a number of issues stating, it was a big, bad week for the Triple C last week in particular. My mentor and editor, Chris Ferrone over at TJM, did a great job of documenting that. So those concerns are legit. But the measure, I think what's really important, is that, the dual implementation of both, rapid decrim. We're talking about if it passes, the vote is the first Tuesday in November. If it passes, then statewide, all of these things would be decriminalized starting December 14th. That's pretty big. That's a pretty rapid expansion of access to these substances with legal protections. Some other things really worth noting about the bill. It includes parental, employment, and medical protections for users. You won't be discriminated against for, in obtaining medical treatment. Your employment status will be protected even if you consume these substances. And then again, claims of hefty civil penalties that have been made by a number of different folks within the grassroots communities are, again, untrue. The measure clearly states that for violations of underage possession, public consumption and possession of larger, quantities larger than personal limits, be a maximum of $100 fine. So there's a lot of good, I think, within this measure. Now, the post-passage and implementation and amendment process is going to be murky, especially because the Joint Committee recently released their report a couple of weeks ago, kind of summarizing their findings from the hearing and the subsequent testimony they received that was written in. And they did note that they viewed decriminalization and establishing a legal regulatory framework as counterproductive and counteracting, and that ultimately they did not recommend that this bill, as it currently stands, be passed. Now, just because they're against it doesn't mean that it won't. Again, this is a statewide ballot measure. The citizens of Massachusetts will have the opportunity to vote on this themselves, but those concerns will be serve as a really interesting gateway into considering what the committee and what legislators might actually do with that post-passage process.
Can you speak to any inclusion in the language around mandatory data collection inside the legal framework? This has been a regular issue for me in the Oregon and Colorado worlds, and the fact that I don't know the status in Colorado at this point, but it looks like you cannot participate in some of these legal frameworks without mandatory data collection and your name going into a pretty substantial repository. They allege, sorry to keep rambling here, I'll make sure to restate
No
the
worries.
question at the end.
Okay.
They allege that data will be anonymous after it's shared, but as people in Massachusetts should understand, in a post Cambridge Analytica world, data is never really all that
Yeah.
private. Like, do you know if Massachusetts is going to have in the proposed rules from New Approach mandatory data collection?
So I am actually reviewing the literature, the actual measure right now. I'm not seeing anything on a scan about data collection in particular. I am happy to obviously get back to you on that, but from my understanding, that is not explicitly stated that data collection is mandatory. Now, again, I am quickly scanning this to try to confirm that, but I have not read
Okay.
anything in it that
If you
indicates that
don't see
myself.
it, we'll leave that as an open question. Then the
Yeah.
next one is, so in Colorado we had a thing where what we voted on was signed into law, and then we had some sort of senator, somebody out of the Boulder region, come back and say, hey, this is too dangerous, blah blah blah, like, here's my proposed edits. And then there was a whole backlash from the Colorado community, and it was a really interesting scenario to watch. Um, but effectively, lawmakers were able to change the laws in really serious ways. Um, I'm curious about, like, is that a possibility in Massachusetts? And secondarily, like, will the commission that will be in charge of would be in charge of putting this forward? Do they have discretion to go beyond what's in the scope of the law?
So I'm not sure about the discretion to go beyond the scope of the law portion, but um, I I would expect that there will be at least an attempt at significant uh, changes or alterations to the proposed framework of specifically of the regulatory, the
Hmm.
legalization process. Especially considering that having attended the hearing, it seems very clear to me, especially based on the committee's line of questioning to both those opposed and in favor, that regulation sooner rather than later, bringing things above board, seems to be what the legislature is most interested in a post passage situation. Um, that said, there's not a lot of politicians who want to take a strong stance on this one way or another. It's obviously still very murky waters, and this is all very new for any state legislature. So I expect that to be an evolving process in terms of policy
Hmm.
specifics. Though I do think it's worth noting one of the more memorable moments from the March 26th hearing was a line of questioning from Representative Fatman, State Senator Fatman, who talked about an frequent attendee of concerts in his youth at Boston Garden, who would often walk around screaming about having fat bags of shrooms for sale, referencing that by saying this stuff has been around, uh, and the committee is aware of that and seems to be keen on bringing it above board sooner rather than later. In a post-pass situation. Now, what's worth noting is that if this measure doesn't pass, uh, according to the Massachusetts state constitution, a similar ballot initiative could not be brought about for at least 6 years. So what we'll
Now,
be
what does
looking
similar
at,
mean?
uh, from my understanding, a psychedelic legalization ballot initiative of this kind would not be allowed to be brought about for at least 6 years. That is my basic understanding of the framing of that. Um, I don't know if like a specific change or inclusion or removal of one drug or another from the specifics of the bill might change that. But from my understanding, it's a pretty broad, blanket applied uh, rule there, law there in terms of what can or can't be brought about in terms of the ballot initiative in particular. Now, again, it's worth noting in the last year alone, 7 different pieces of legalization legislation have been brought about by various members of the state house, predominantly by Representative Nicholas Bodega, as I mentioned previously. So there are pathways towards legalization through the legislature, but and one might argue that from a grassroots activist standpoint, that if the ballot measure weren't to pass, that could be an effective way forward. But given uh, the reveal yesterday, the FDA's decision and the inevitable cultural kind of lulling on, at least from the casual voter's perspective, on the viability of legal psychedelics, which at least I would anticipate, um, the legislature is probably not going to be as warm to making groundbreaking progressive passage of legislation anytime soon, especially if the
So
voters vote against it.
this this seems like an interesting move. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So
Yes, sir.
new approach starts operating in Massachusetts. They get everything together to propose a bill at the state level, um, likely with full knowledge that if this doesn't work, they have 7 years of work to do, or 6 years to wait to do something similar.
Mhm.
Um, that seems interesting at the start. I know that new approach moves very fast, and that to
Mhm.
me seems like almost a like uh like a hostage taking move. Um, can considering how fast they moved, considering I know portions of the psychedelic ecosystem in Massachusetts that were absolutely not included by Bay Staters or New Approach,
Yeah.
and good portions of it, right? And they've
Mhm.
been around for many decades. And
Yeah.
to just come in and say, hey, we got this thing. Oh, sorry, pulled the pin on this hand grenade, in or out. That seems a little tough, to me. And I've been seeing a lot of bad behavior in the psychedelic scene for a long time. And I just, I want to name that as like kind of not super awesome behavior,
Agreed.
in my
I think
perspective.
I think that's a valid criticism. I think, like I mentioned at the start of our conversation, this is battleground, state for what happens next. Not only for the movement and at large, but if a new approach goes 3 for 3, they're the group. They're the leaders of this movement on a state by state level across the rest of this movement. I think, but if it stalls out here, who knows? We don't
Hmm.
necessarily know what comes next for new approaches, de facto leadership of the legalization movement on a state by state
Right.
level. So I do think it's a pretty big gamble. I think there were a number of missteps that the campaign made in the early days of signature collection. There was controversy surrounding volunteers identifying themselves as, uh, you know, canvassers identifying themselves as volunteers, even though they were actually hired to do so. Again, I think it's pretty standard practice to hire
Hmm.
canvassers, college kids, but they were also caught on camera providing seemingly false information about the specifics of the ballot. I think that probably comes down to poor training and onboarding
Hmm.
and rushing people out there to gather signatures. And I don't think that that's necessarily like a top-down malicious intent situation, but I do think that given they stumbled through the first portion of this and still managed to get 96,000 signatures, that they still remain fairly confident
Hmm.
that this will pass and that they will continue to be the leaders from a political action committee standpoint, from an establishment political advocacy standpoint, in whatever states come next.
Yeah. Well, if they become leaders, I hope they
Yes.
choose to behave better, um, and make less mistakes and get more stakeholder feedback. One thing that really rubbed me the wrong way about the Colorado, project is that the committee was made up of a lot of people from outside of Colorado. And there was no
Yeah.
real
Same with
imperative for them
Oregon.
to move to Colorado. Um, a lot of people with a lot of experience were very much looked over, and a number of people were put in power to be making really big decisions without having any background in the space. And this is a classic
Yeah.
issue in the cannabis industry. Regulators making all sorts of decisions, kind of tragically bad decisions that, are still impacting the industry today. Um, and I'm concerned about that happening again. It sounds like, uh, this bill will require people to move to Massachusetts if they get selected, but doesn't necessarily mean that they need to live in Massachusetts, as they're
Mhm.
nominated. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. From my understanding, yeah, it would require residency, but not. Yeah, but the parameters of when that move might happen in terms of the appointment process are fairly murky. Um, I do think one of the things that I find particularly interesting about the independently appointed, regulatory board, idea. Again, it seems like this is one of those things that could very well be amended, or could be fairly malleable in a post passage process.
Like in
Um,
Colorado,
but
it seemed really clear that New Approach kind of made a number of suggestions, and they were kind of wholesale,
yeah,
taken.
no, agreed. And
And like, that's kind of a stab in the heart. If there is intent for leadership and trust, these kinds of mistakes, like, we need to be really explicit about them. Um,
yeah,
but if you don't care about trust and you don't care about a democratic process here, yeah, cool. Like, throw cash at it, lie, cheat, steal. Like, great. Like, having your staffers misrepresent themselves as volunteers, like, that's a pretty substantial issue. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
No, it's
Um,
valid. It's definitely valid. I think we've seen the operation in terms of those working on, for mass for mental health options expand in recent months. They brought on a number of grassroots activists as consultants, and as members of their formal uh, leadership team, which I think is a signal, that yeah, they made some missteps and more than a few. And again, I think I have heard many complaints about the Colorado process and specifically,
Hmm.
with that independently appointed board. I know from my
What do you mean by
understanding that,
independently appointed board?
well, not elected, not elected. Um,
Right. The
so
governor
like that of
selected
the triple C.
everybody.
Yeah.
The governor's
Yes.
deputy, yeah, was the person that made those
Yeah.
appointments. And so yeah, like what I'm seeing out here, like there's a lot of people commenting as we're going live. They said it's pretty explicit that it's a 90-day window that people need to move to Massachusetts. So,
Okay. Appreciate
there's
that.
and people can go ahead and fact check us and comment in the threads later on this one.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it looks like 90 days after appointment they need to move over. So that feels better than what's happening in Colorado. It doesn't feel perfect. Um,
Yeah.
it still feels like there's a little bit of a problem there. Massachusetts is a complicated place, as I'm sure you're understanding with your
Yeah.
journalism. Um,
Very much so.
yeah, um, yeah, it's like sure, super super left, except like wildly conservative Democrats are often in power in the state,
Yeah.
and that's something
Very
that's
much so.
like and honestly very pro drug war Democrats, if we want to name it that way.
Very
So
small d Democrats, if you will, for sure.
yeah. Um, but yeah, it seems very interesting to me how this is all playing out, and it smells very similar to what I lived through, and I just wanted to
Hmm.
like name that.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I would love to, I guess, to put a general call out to whoever's tuning in, would love to hear directly from as many people in Colorado and Oregon as possible about their experiences. I know that I've spoken at length with Noah Heller of Psilocybin, Oregon. I know you've spoken to him as well. I think he's a fascinating guy and really sharp about kind of some of the flaws in the certification and licensing process in Oregon. And I've spoken to a few folks that are well connected in Colorado who have voiced many of the concerns that you have, obviously, living out there yourself. And I, more than anything else, want to hear from all of the perspectives that exist out there on any angle or side of this conversation. So, by all means, please reach out to me. I am eager to listen and hear from as many people as possible about these issues. And I really do think, I know we're running a little bit short on time here, but again, I come back to it. I've said it before, and I think in the wake of yesterday's decision from the FDA, I'll say it again. What happens in Massachusetts is going to determine the future of legal psychedelics in this country for the next 10 to 15 years at minimum.
And let's dig
And
into that once
Massachusetts is,
again because this is a pretty major point you're making, and it was all the way from the beginning. But Massachusetts is influential for sure. But how do you like to think about this?
well, so much of the biotech research that fuels pharmaceutical innovation and drug development innovation is centered right here in Boston. Not only that, there's a prime pipeline for um, you know real licensing and certification standards being kind of proliferated through the many number of very high quality uh, higher education institutions here. So we've seen out in Colorado, Naropa University's new psychedelic studies minor and their professional certificate program. I'm very keen to see if that model can be applied to any number of uh, high quality higher education, colleges and universities here. So not only is the licensing and certification the future of that process and what those standards are and how do we make that uh, conscious of the spiritual elements that go into these use of these substances and therapeutic use of these substances, recreational otherwise, with some of the medicalization concerns. um, but I think one of the things that's also very interesting, and I spoke at length with Noah Heller about this, but Colorado has a very strong tradition of ethnogenic and plant medicine communities that I think Massachusetts has a pretty interesting collection of psychedelic churches and plant medicine communities in their own right that are currently operating on a legal capacity in local municipalities and I think could be key players in the fleshing out of regulatory body and how that intertwines with a decriminalized system across the board. So and again, historically speaking, Massachusetts has long been the tastemaker for massive social policy reform, making the state to national jump or making the state to state jump. Massachusetts, I mean, dating all the way back to 1636, we were Boston Commons, the first public park in America. I'm not going to go full history lesson, but we, legalized gay marriage in the early 2010s. Obama, Romney Care, Mass Health here in Massachusetts, universal health care is kind of the precursor to Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. Um, Massachusetts, not only from a political notice standpoint, but obviously from all the things I just mentioned, higher education, biotech and finance tech industries here in Massachusetts, on so many levels, this, what happens here, especially not only now until November, but in the post passage implementation process, will shape the future of policy in Maryland, Illinois, Mexico, and Missouri, all the states that are soon to follow. Will base their models not off of the Oregon and Colorado model, but off of the model here in Massachusetts. Because third time could be the charm in terms of creating a template for where this could fit in a variety of political climates, state to state. So
It's interesting. I don't wholeheartedly agree. I see the argument you're trying to make, that Massachusetts has had a leadership position nationwide in some places. Um, I think time will tell if that does hold.
agreed.
I'm personally a lot more excited about the proposed bill in New York that would allow people to possess without any kind
Mhm.
of regulatory framework other than, did you take the right ed to carry your mushroom carry
Yeah,
permit, which is interesting.
it's an
I'm
interesting one.
also very much opposed to psychedelic exceptionalism, and I think these state level ballot initiatives are often very colorblind about what is the drug harm happening here in our state,
Agreed.
when it's really just a hyper racist war on people, um, and we're all in the same camp here. This is a war that the government's been perpetuating on us for many decades, and how do we want to think about this stuff? How do we want to pressure these lobby groups that have a lot of interesting, I'll say it, somewhat secret money to play with? Um, how,
Yeah,
how can we get them to start engaging in this drug exceptionalist conversation? How can we get them to be a little bit more, if not a lot more, democratic? Um,
yeah,
it's okay to pump the fucking brakes, guys, for 2 months to get a
mhm,
little bit more research done before you put us in, in the Massachusetts case, like I pointed out earlier, kind of a hostage scenario, which isn't
yeah,
very kind. So
agreed.
yes, are they operating in good faith? Perhaps. I don't know them. They haven't really engaged with me as an organization. I've wanted to talk to a lot of the funders for a long time. The people with their feet on the ground, they're very different, and they're
Agreed.
approachable, they're engageable, but they have people calling the shots for what they can and cannot do, which is definitely something that we need to watch.
Yes, sir. No, I agree. And I think to that point, and I'll close with this because I know we're short on time. As far as to your point, about kind of expanding the conversation, I think I lost thought. I apologize.
It's
I
all good.
do not know where I was
Yeah.
going with that statement, but yeah,
So yeah, I appreciate you sharing all the detail, all the complexity that's happening here. There's clearly a complicated situation at play, and you're doing a pretty decent job covering that. Um, and yeah, people should, if you live in Massachusetts, pay attention. If you live in states surrounding Massachusetts, pay attention. Um, Understand what a well-funded lobby group is. Understand what a local organization is. Local organizations can still have flawed leaders. Um, Same with well-funded lobbies. So
yeah,
how does the public want to deal and interact?
yeah,
People should try to learn more. You know.
yeah. And to that
Mhm.
point, I would recommend that the movement that we've seen kind of in protest and successfully was mounted against the FDA's assumed to be pending approval of Lykos's MDMA drug treatment, was led in part by, in particular, I really want to shout out Dr. Nishi Devano from Symposia, who I think is one of the most important truth tellers in this space,
That's
and I
interesting.
think is one of the straightest shooters that I've met. I
Mm.
trust, while I don't have necessarily a specific stance because I'm not as well versed in the ins and outs of that entire decision. I think that if there was ever a blueprint for how a populist movement could have a significant impact on the establishment's decision making when it comes to legalization of psychedelics, that Nishi Devano is somebody that we should hear a lot more from as to how to effectively do that, because they succeeded. Whether you agree with the FDA decision or not, this was a petition that they did not have to honor or even listen to. And because of the momentum that Nishi and a number of other fantastic voices in that space raised, the FDA and the ICER by extension decided to listen, and they heard and they decided. And I think it's, again, really a testament to the populist influence that can be had on the establishment leaders within this movement. And
Mm.
so I am eager to hear more from folks like Dr. Devano and others of her stead.
Yeah, you might ask for their opinion on the Massachusetts bill. Based on my understanding, they would not be a big fan. But let's uh
Yes, sir.
let's wrap here for now. Thank you so much. Where can people find your
Thank
works
you.
at, Jack?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram and Twitter, Jack Gorsline, Jack.Gorsline. My handle's on both. I'm on LinkedIn. I would encourage folks to find me there, but primarily my work has been published so far through TJM. I'm working closely with Victoria from Psychedelics Today as well on a number of different pieces that are non-policy specific. So stay tuned for that. And I will kind of tease that, a major grassroots related bombshell is coming soon. And stay tuned to TJM for the latest in the weeks ahead.
Right on. All right, Jack. Thanks for your
Yeah.
time. Hope
Thank
people
you, Joe.
follow up. You got it.
Yes, sir.